video here just to give you guys an overview of what genetically modified crops are.
We did not give that to you. I forgot to give it to you.
Sorry, guys.
Oh, there you go.
The real story behind Proposition 46 started with the trial lawyers. They wrote and paid for Prop 46.
What is a GMO? Well, it's an organism that's been genetically modified. This means scientists combine the DNA of one or more organisms for some specific genetic feature. Usually this entails engineering plants with toxic bacteria that kill bugs that try to eat the genetically modified plant. Currently, up to 88% of corn grown in the US is genetically modified, 91% of soybeans, and 88% of cotton are GMO crops as well. These raw foods are then widely used in food production processes. Nearly 3 of every 4 processed foods contains at least one GMO ingredient. It's almost impossible to avoid products containing GMOs. Everything from soda and juice to canned tuna, breakfast cereal, even milk, and delicious bacon can be genetically modified. Currently, though, GMO products sit camouflaged on the store shelf. Consumers have no way of knowing if the food they are eating is genetically modified frankenfood or not. GMO labeling was, however, legally mandated. Consumers would have the power to choose for themselves. Because after all, you do have the right to know what's in your food.
So this is just an overview of the process of them taking a specific DNA extraction here and then going through the transformation and inserting it into the plant. And this is just kind of like you have it over in the video. And different scientists are saying different things. Like Dr. Williams, for example, in the article, he doesn't believe that it should, he thinks it's bogus, like a bogus fear that scientists or other people have against the health risks of genetically modified food. And on the other hand, you have another doctor, Dr. Goldberg, who says, like, okay, 30 years ago, we didn't know what would happen if you put a different genome into and how they react. And his point of view is just to be aware, and he wants to just to be concerned, like do more tests through the article. And he was saying that if we had, if we were doing this genetically modified foods, we don't know what the outcome is going to be, and we may not know until generations later. And we don't have a lot of scientists that are going to say that there is a harm or there is a risk because of credibility. A lot of scientists that try to prove that genetically modified crops will potentially have a health risk, their credibility gets shut out and they don't get a lot of support from it because most funding for genetically goes to support genetically modified crops rather than trying to figure out, the safety risks and health risks and everything. And this causes most biologists to just refrain from trying to do any research at all. Even if they do see problems, they either just going to be really bold and present it, or they're not going to say anything. And there are certain benefits going along with genetically modified crops, if we have genetically modified crops, the price of the food will potentially go down, and in 2050, the the human population is going to go up, and if we do not have genetically modified crops, our food supply would be down here. But they also believe that genetically modified crops could fill in this potential gap in 2050. And genetically modified crops helps keep farmers safe. How, I don't know, but that's what was in the article. And where the world stands, only 1/10 of the world is actually using genetically modified crops, such as the U.S., Argentina, Canada, and Brazil. But even in the U.S., we have 20 states that want to at least have, as you heard in the video, genetically modified, like a label. So that way, when you're going grocery shopping, you know if you're eating a genetically modified crop or not. And this is a timeline of the history of where the fear began. In the 1970s, scientists from University of Washington had started the first genetically modified tobacco plant. And there was a little, reservations from it, but it wasn't too much. But at the time, it was just something new. But then 20 years later, in 1990, specifically 1997, they had first introduced genetically modified crops to consumers. And a lot of famous chefs at the time had disapproved of genetically modified crops, and that kind of just put the society on a hold if they wanted to do it or not. And ever since then, they've been a little more resistant into supporting genetically modified crops. And later on, a lot of countries in Europe and France, they are supporting a principle called the precautionary principle, and it's just saying that to test everything and make sure that it's absolutely safe before we put it in the market. And a lot of scientists that support genetically modified crops are refuting that because they're saying there's no way that we can absolutely prove that it's safe. We can do probability, but we can't say that it's absolutely safe. And they have this because given that a catastrophe can happen or a toxic can emerge from it or anything from the crop, the efforts should be shut down until we can prove. We don't want to send out genetically modified crops and then it can set off an epidemic in the world. And it has been seen that there's genetically modified technology is no different than selective breeding. It just enables scientists to have a specific genome, like a single gene, and to place it into a plant. But this gene can come from another species of plant, a bacterium, a virus, or even an animal. And this was a question that had rose up in the article: if plants with altered genes allow DNA to work its way into our own. And the scientists believe that yes, it's theoretically possible, but it's highly improbable. And by the time the bacteria goes through our gut, it wouldn't reach the cells. And they also say that humans are exposed to these type of viruses and bacteria every day, and it shouldn't cause too much of a risk. And not a single case has been verified that an illness has ever arose from genetically modified crops. So they're kind of just basing this off of if we've seen it or not. It doesn't mean it's not happening. And I thought this was pretty interesting. In the article, Friedman had brought up that a lot of scientists believe that it's politics rather than science. And he believes that, and a lot of other scientists believe that because they're saying that the government doesn't want different corporations to have too much control over the food supply. And Goldberg, as I had talked about earlier in the presentation, he believes that this has nothing to do with science, but ideology. And for example, of a lot of scientists doing experiments and being shut down for credibility, a scientist by the name of Seralini from France, he had to in an experiment with rats all eating the same type of corn crop. And most of the rats had contracted cancer at an alarming rate. But this experiment was refuted because they believed that he had chosen rats that easily developed tumors. He didn't use enough rats, and even the European Food Safety Authority dismissed his study findings. And they were saying if corn was really that toxic, someone would be aware of it. And the persistent doubts are saying that the long-term effects can be subtle, but it's nearly impossible to link a specific change in the environment to a genetically modified crop. And a single well-characterized gene can still settle in a target plant's genome in many different ways. It can go in backwards, forward, different locations, have multiple copies, and they all do different things. So you just want to be careful. And the kinds of alternations that they're doing from other species might be impactful if they're not doing it in at least the same species in the same way. And that's another thing to be concerned about. And just because we don't have any evidence of a genetic material going into, from an altered crop can make it into a genome of people doesn't mean that it's not happening. And it might have happened and we just haven't noticed it yet. So another persistent doubt is, I thought this was interesting. I wanted to research it a little more, but insertional mutagenesis, I don't know if I say that, but it's basically saying that the insertion of genes ends up quieting the other activity of genes nearby. I thought that was really interesting. And changing a single gene might turn out to be more impactful than we believe, because it can create new proteins that can be toxins or allergens. And in the future, an article is saying that future genetically modified crops can be introduced to the world, but as long as it's done safely and if testing is improved. But additional testing may compromise the production of genetically modified crops in society. But I believe that in order for this to happen, for it to be proven safe, we shouldn't condemn other scientists from trying to prove, if it's safe or not. And their credibility shouldn't be on the line. Yes, they should have, appropriate rats or that they're going to test an appropriate amount, but they should have an open door in order to do the testing and proving. So, a question proposed is going to happen if it gets more strict when it comes to genetically modified crops, and I believe it'll become safer, because if they get more strict, then we'll be able to do more testing and it'll be better for the population food consumption. That's it.
So any question? Greg, you have a question? Yeah.
Is there a chance that, say, if an individual ate genetic crops all the time, and that his body would be accustomed to it, which means if he went back to ungenetic crops, that his body would reject those?
I read another article, and he had brought that same exact proposal up. So I can't remember all the science that was into it, but he was saying that if a baby was eating genetically modified crops since it was a toddler and going on, his or her body would become immune to the different viruses and bacteria in his system. So it wouldn't really have that much of an effect of if we were eating organic foods and then all of a sudden went to a genetically modified crop, that would it could potentially hurt us, but we wouldn't have the specific to say, specifically what had happened.
Okay, so you would have to start young in order to not have any effect.
I looked and it didn't say what, even if you had an effect, they wouldn't be able to go back and see where that effect had started from. and it originated from. And they had talked about a little bit in my article as well, but they're not saying that there's a specific like gene that had caused if you have gotten an illness.
Thank you, Jagdish.